Joining our lecture series for the Central Coast Wildlife Society. I'm Sean Wagner. I'm a president-elect, and we are really happy to have Julie Phillips giving talk on Tule elk. Julie has been studying the reintroduced elk throughout the range in California for many years to better understand their natural history and how they've adjusted to living among the new human landscape. Julie has been teaching nature-based field courses for over 30 years and is the author of a citizen's guide, a citizen's guide to Tule elk. And thank you, Julie, for joining us, and take it away.
Okay, thank you, Sean. And thank you, team, for having me here. I appreciate it. Can you hear me okay? So this is our native Tule elk, and the common name is Tule elk. The scientific name is Cervus canadensis nannodes, and that has changed over a while, but now it is a unique subspecies of elk in North America. And it's also considered a flagship species for California. And that'll become more evident as I talk what that actually means. So isn't this elk beautiful? It's one of my favorite photos of a bull elk, a male. Okay, let's see. Now there's, oh, there it goes, okay. So here is the original distribution of elk in North America. And again, these were all now considered Cervus canadensis. They're all subspecies. So originally there were 6 subspecies of North American elk. And you can see here, oops, it's gonna keep doing that, sorry. So you could see where the number 1 is in that large area. If I move the thing, it goofs it up. So that's the eastern elk, which is now extinct, number 1. Number 2 is the Manitobanus elk, and recently they found some, so that subspecies is still considered extant or here. Number 3, you can see down below, that's the Merriam's elk, and that is considered extinct. And number 5 in the center there to the left is the Rocky Mountain elk, and they go throughout the United States up into Canada, and they're still with us. The Roosevelt elk is number 6 over there at the far left-hand side, the Pacific Northwest, northwestern part of California, and they're still with us. And then there's the native Tule elk that you see in California, the number 4. And again, there are now 4 subspecies still found, thankfully, in North America. And so this is the Roosevelt elk, which is the largest of the subspecies. Aren't they just beautiful? They're also called the Olympic Elk Cervus canadensis roosevelti. These bulls can get up to 1,100 pounds. They're huge. They'd be 900 to 1,100 pounds. So they're the largest of the remaining subspecies. And here's the Rocky Mountain elk, and these are all cows. The females are called cows. And the Cervus canadensis nelsoni, which are found throughout much of the Rocky Mountain states and into the northeastern part of California. And then here's our native Tule elk, which again is an endemic. So we are the only state that has our own subspecies of North American elk, which is so cool. So it's considered a California endemic species. And the scientific name is Cervus canadensis nannodes. And aren't they beautiful? These are some of the original elk reintroduced in the Diablo range. And again, the males have antlers, the females don't. The males are called bulls, the females are called cows, and the young are called calves. So these are some of the original elk reintroduced in the early 80s. And this just kind of shows you an overview of the distribution of elk in California. And you can see again in the far left-hand side is the Roosevelt elk. And the red area shows you their current range. So they're found in you can go to parts of California in the northwestern part of California to see them. The Rocky Mountain elk from the northeastern, as I mentioned, in the red area is where you can still see them in a couple of spots. And then this shows you the original distribution of Tule elk in California. So the Tule elk once ranged as far north as Mount Shasta and along the foothills of the Sierra to the east. They never went up to the high Sierra. They're a lower elevation Central Valley subspecies, but they're along the foothills all the way down to Bakersfield, Buena Vista area, and then all along the California coastline. So that dotted little area there shows you the original Tule elk range. And then as early settlers came to California and other areas in the early 1800s and 1700s, so on, by the 1800s, the elk were extensively shot for meat, fur, and lard. And by 1860, you can see that all the Tule elk range, the elk were killed throughout much of its range and was only found a small area around the Bakersfield, Central Valley area. By 1874, it was thought the Tule elk were extinct. So they went from 500,000 less than probably to 20 is what we figure. And the good news is in 1874, a rancher by the name of Henry Miller found a small population of Tule elk on his property. and he ordered his ranch hands to protect them, and then gradually those numbers increased. So again, this just shows you, here's the decline of a subspecies of North American elk, the Tule elk, and you can see its original pristine range, as I mentioned, 1800s. Again, extensive hunting, no control over it, and that shows you the present in the lower right-hand side, but there's more elk herds than that now, but this is an old graphic, but it's kind of a cool one. And again, that just a reminder that originally there were 500,000 Tule elk, which is pretty amazing. So fairly typical how management has worked with protection of our native species over time. The decline of the Tule elk in the 1800s, management by what we call trial and error, not really sure how to bring them back. But a group of leaders emerged and they passed legislation that mandated responsible management of Tule elk herds. And that occurred from 1971 to 1987. The Bear Bill was passed by the California Senate in 1971. The Tule Elk Preservation Act by the feds was passed by Congress, was passed in 1976. And so this shows you the Bear Bill, which set California state legislature enacted the Bear Bill, which prohibited the public or the hunting of Tule in California until the state numbers reached 2,000, or it could be determined there was no longer suitable elk habitat. So that was pretty cool that a bill was actually passed that protected this species or subspecies. And then there was the Tule Elk Preservation Act. This was the federal law. And again, it declared 2000 as a national goal. The Tule elk was the first subspecies that we know, or species, where there was actually a joint resolution of Congress, which is pretty darn amazing. They also declared that the Tule elk in Owens Valley watershed, which is not part of the native range of the Tule elk, but was one of the original herds reestablished, would not exceed 490 as determined by the state of California. And then here's the general provisions. And I think it's just cool to kind of see this, that the act requires the Secretary of the Interior, the Secretary of Agriculture, and the Secretary of Defense. All those agencies work together to cooperate with the state of California in making lands under this jurisdiction, under their jurisdiction, reasonably available for the preservation and grazing of Tule elk in a manner consistent with federal law. So the Secretary of Interior, in coordination with all federal, state, and other offices within the jurisdiction over Tule elk lands or potential habits, must develop a plan for Tule elk restoration and conservation. And that's what's really amazing, is this much effort went in to protect and bring back these native Tule elk. So again, the legislation mandates responsible management, the two bills that I mentioned, and then a Tule elk interagency task force was formed. And the cool thing is that reintroduction became the primary management tool. That means taking the Tule elk and reestablishing herds in part in their native range. So introduction is putting them into non-native areas like Owens Valley in the eastern section of California, but reintroduction became a primary tool, which was pretty visionary at the time. That mandate was revoked in 1988 till the current time. Hunting is now the primary management tool. So they're basically saying there's no more viable areas to put Tule elk, which I don't totally agree with. But anyway, right now the state elk count, according to the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, is about 5,700. It's probably less than that now, with some disappearance of some of the herds, as well as the die-off that's been occurring at Point Reyes National Seashore. So just kind of reviewing, less than 20 elk by the 1870s. In 1914, a herd at Buena Vista, about 400 elk in southern San Joaquin Valley, was established. There were attempts to establish new herds using both introduction and reintroduction as a primary tool. By 1969, a captive herd at Tupman State Reserve had 32 elk. Cache Creek up in the more northern area had 80 elk. And Owens Valley, which is not part of native range, had 300 elk. But it's just cool to show you what kind of an effort went on. Again, this on the map on the left shows you the reintroduction, the sites that were established by 1983. And then in 1978, herds were established in other areas, including Point Reyes. We'll talk more about the Diablo range, where the herds were brought there. And then hunting became their primary tool, as I mentioned. So this is a map that I came up with in my Tule elk guide. And again, I'm happy to share the guide with anyone that would like a copy of it. This actually is still valid today as of 2021. Now there's 22 herds and there's over 5,000 Tule elk. So this, but still, the cool part is to see on the left-hand side, you can see the different categories of herds. So there's what we call captive or fenced herds. And these are ones that are captive. And Point Reyes has a captive herd, Tupman State Elk Reserve, as I mentioned, and San Luis Island in the San Luis National Wildlife Refuge area. There's semi-wild herds like Grizzly Island. You can see it on the map. It's number 4 on there, kind of a pink number 4 in Solano County. And again, I'm sorry I can't use the pointer, but it actually causes this to go forward. So I'm sorry about that. And then there's wild free roaming herds where it's possible to see elk on public lands or semi-private lands. And I think this is really an important category, is we want people to be able to see our native tule elk. That was the vision, that was the hope. And it's actually pretty tough to see them in most areas. So Point Reyes is nice because people can see free roaming herds. They're not captive. The Coyote Valley landscape, the Diablo Range, Anderson Reservoir, Jackson, Santa Clara County Parks, Coyote Ridge. Sometimes you'll see elk, but some of those have disappeared, but there's still some on the VTA lands. The Gavilan Mountains at Fremont State Park still has elk, which is pretty cool free roaming. Pacheco State Park and San Luis Reservoir are really one of the best places to see elk, especially at San Luis, the reservoir, the state recreation area. You can see free roaming elk around it as you travel through 152, and I'll mention that more. Carrizo Plains National Monument is one of the original herds I studied as well. Unfortunately, most of those have disappeared, and there's some you can see on the ecological areas of Fish and Game, the Chimeneas Ranch. Wind Wolves Preserve, which is down at the bottom in Kern County, number 9. That's a private held reserve that's protecting the elk. They're doing a fabulous job. They do private tours. Coast State Park, it's hard to find the elk in there. Sonora East Bay Regional Park, sometimes you'll see them in there. Cache Creek, Covelo, and so on. The rest of those all have herds that you can possibly see. The wild free roaming herds on private lands, obviously most of those you can't see. The Gavilan Mountains, San Antonio Reservoir, South Valley ecological areas. Sometimes you can see them in there. San Felipe Ranch is a private ranch, and unfortunately, there are no longer elk there. It's one of the original herds that I studied. Isabel Valley, you can sometimes see them, Coyote Ridge, and San Antonio Reservoir. And then the fenced herds on public lands, again, Fort Hunter, look at it, is the last one that you can see that down there, up there as well, in the Monterey County area. And then wild free roaming herds, Owens Valley is to the far right in Inyo County, and those are areas that are not part of their historic range, as well as Jawbone Canyon. So this map's kind of a cool map because it gives you a feel for the tule elk that we now see. Now focusing on Santa Clara County, this is the Diablo Range, which is a great place for the tule elk. It's part of their native range, and you can see it's perfect habitat. So the tule elk love the native oaks. They co-evolved the native oaks and the native grasslands. So both the oak savanna, native grassland, and then the oak woodlands have been really critical habitat. And so this is standing on the Diablo Range, looking to the west. So you're standing on the Diablo Range, looking out across Santa Clara Valley, over towards the Santa Cruz Mountains. And you can see there, you can see Loma Prieta there. As you look out, you're looking over towards Monterey Bay. So isn't that just a beautiful view? But this is all part of historic tule elk range, which is so cool. So this is, again, more of the Diablo Range, and you can see elk there on the hillside. They love this oak savanna, open woodlands. And the hope is that over time, the tule elk will help regenerate the native oaks, will help restore some of the native grasslands, which they're doing in some areas where they're protected, which is cool. Well, a rancher by the name of Bill Hewlett, which you may know of San Felipe Ranch, Hewlett and Packard, they have the San Felipe Ranch in the Diablo Range, and that was one of the areas where the tule elk were reintroduced in the late 70s. And unfortunately, those original reintroductions were not successful. Well, I came in as a graduate student in early 1980, and my job was to study the reintroduction of the tule elk at San Felipe Ranch in the Diablo Range and find out where the elk were going, what happened to those original reintroductions. So this is San Felipe Ranch, and again, Bill Hewlett was instrumental in bringing elk to Santa Clara County, which again is pretty cool. So here's San Felipe Ranch, and because the first 2 reintroductions were not successful, the decision was made to hold the elk captive for a few months to allow them to acclimate before they were released. So historically, they'd bring elk into a new location. They'd open up the trailers with the elk in them, the elk had been managed by people and been around people for several days. They were really stressed. They'd open up the trailers and the elk would just take off. And so the decision was made to bring the elk in these specially designed trailers, and the elk were placed into a holding pen. You can see this is about 6-foot plus fence in that holding pen. Actually, tule elk can actually jump right over this fence, but if you put burlap around them, they learned in the early reintroductions, the elk won't jump. If they can't see through it, they won't go over it. So the elk were brought in and placed into these holding pens. And again, it was decided that they would be held there for 2 or 3 months, letting them acclimate. So again, I was brought in just kind of watching them from the outside for a little bit, getting used to it. And you can see some of the females have collars. And so the females some of the females in the herd were, they put radio telemetry collars on them. They don't put radio telemetry collars on the males because during the rut season, their necks will swell, and they learned over time that these collars created a problem for the bull elk. So females now are the ones in general for Tule elk that where they put these radio telemetry collars. Those radio telemetry collars emit a signal. The signal is picked up by a tracker. And so my job was, once the elk were released, to go out and follow them and figure out what happened and where they went. And again, look at this beautiful habitat. This is perfect elk habitat. Look in the beautiful oak woodlands. They're just spectacular. As I mentioned, the valley oaks, the blue oaks, and so on, they're just really quite amazing. And so this is what happened in the Diablo range. You can see the map, the one at the center dot there, that's where the original reintroduction occurred. And some of the elk traveled north, some took off and went to the east over Mount Hamilton, some dropped down towards Pacheco Pass, some along the Coyote Ridge, so they kind of scattered. And again, my job was to go out and try to find them and figure out what happened. And again, that's been a challenge. Now we're learning more years later what actually was happening in some cases behind the scenes, but it hasn't been an easy story for the Tule elk because often landowners and others don't want elk on their property or don't want them on public lands where there's grazing occurring because they feel they compete with non-native domestic livestock. And so there's been this kind of theme behind the scenes. And being a person who was studying the elk in the 80s, especially a woman, it was a little bit of a challenge because people were often mad at you because the elk were there. And so this kind of dislike for them was a very difficult situation. And it was my job to try to interact with people and try to get them to understand, but it really was a challenge because, again, people saw this as a threat because the elk often didn't stay in areas targeted for Tule elk, including on public lands. The other place where I studied the elk was Carrizo Plains National Monument in San Luis Obispo County. And the elk, again, were brought in into that national monument, which is obviously federal lands. And it was really important. Again, you can see that here. This kind of shows you the diagram. Carrizo Plains is number 8. You can kind of see they're down to the far left in San Luis Obispo County. They were brought into that national monument, which is a perfect place for reintroduction of Tule elk because it's federal lands. But there were businesses that had grazing rights within Carrizo Plains that were not happy about the Tule elk coming. The land was pretty degraded as well because it still is because of great non-domestic livestock grazing it. So it just created this dynamic that was really tough. And the elk often dispersed into surrounding areas, but they belonged there, belonged in these places like, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, ecological areas and so on. But again, there's hunting that occurs in some of those ecological areas that it just created this conflict. And so this is what happened as well. So here it shows you the reintroduction sites around Carrizo Plains National Monument, little ponds arranged there and so on. And those dots, the very center, see where they originated, that's what happened. The elk simply shifted. They shifted to other lands. And a lot of the elk were hard to find. It was very, very difficult to track them. A lot of them were shot. There was kind of a thing that I learned years later called the 3 S's. I don't know if you've heard of this: shoot, shovel, and shut up. And that's happened, unfortunately, on both public and private lands. Now learning years later that the elk were also chased off of public lands and private lands with helicopters. There were people that chased them and shot them on horseback. So the Tule elk story has been a very difficult one. And yet there's some successes, which is cool. But again, it was amazing that the state of California was pushing this effort to reintroduce the Tule elk. And one of the themes behind it was that Tule elk would help restore and protect the native landscape, which is pretty cool. These are some images from around Carrizo Plains National Monument. Some of the elk that left Carrizo Plains actually traveled all the way down through agricultural fields down to Interstate 5. So I had to go down and track the elk off Interstate 5, which is pretty crazy to see an elk there. But again, that's kind of what happened. What was going on at night was a really difficult story. Another cool place that I think has been the real success story, as I mentioned early on, was San Luis Reservoir off of Highway 152. You can see it on the left-hand side there. And there's some out in the fields nearby the reservoir and also Pacheco Pass State Park. So those areas are cool because there's actually people in those areas. San Luis Reservoir has people from the state recreation area and from the state park that actually carry guns and protect wildlife. I mean, they're simply there on the land, they're visible. And so in areas where elk are protected like that, they actually reestablish and do quite well. So it's really wonderful to drive along 152 to San Luis Reservoir, and you can see the elk free roaming. They're free roaming herds, they're peaceful, and that was for me exciting to find that at Pacheco Pass State Park. We did some initial work later on in early 2000, tracking the elk in Pacheco Pass State Park around San Luis, and we found some pretty amazing things. And one of the things we found is in areas where the cattle were removed from public lands that had been historically grazed by cattle, the native grasses, the native oaks were all coming back there regenerating. And this is one of the locations in Pacheco Pass State Park. Like, we were so excited when we found this spot because it was hard to find areas where the elk were protected, where they could actually graze. And elk won't actually chew things down to the ground unless they don't have anything else, but they kind of will graze for a while and browse, and then they move and they shift. They're constantly moving and shifting within their little range. And what that does is it allows these perennial bunch grasses to come back. So these perennial bunch grasses can have huge underground root structures, and the Tule elk kind of co-evolve with that. So again, they won't eat them down to the ground like cattle. Cattle will literally eat perennial bunch grasses down to the ground, and even our native annual grasses, and they'll actually eventually take out the root systems. Elk don't do that. And so they kind of graze and browse and move. And so they obviously co-evolve the landscape and make that a really important part of our long-term landscape ecosystem restoration. So here's a couple of bulls, and again, aren't they beautiful? And they're obviously in velvet. They look just so cool. So these are two bulls with their getting ready for the rutting season. And another place where you can find Tule elk, which is on public lands, is Tule elk at Point Reyes National Seashore. Point Reyes National Seashore is part of our national park system. It's the only national park in California that has our native Tule elk, and our national parks are our most protected lands in the United States. They're what we call restricted use lands. There's 3 categories of federal lands, and these are the most protected. Point Reyes, again, is part of the historic range. And again, to have a California endemic species which is found only in California, is completely compatible and supports the mission of a national park. So they absolutely belong in Point Reyes. And one of the difficulties now is they're competing, according to these ranches there, with non-native exotic species like the cattle. So that's a whole nother story. Again, the Tule elk were reintroduced, returned to their historic range in Point Reyes. 10 elk were brought in 1978, which is pretty cool. Then eventually, as that herd grew, 28 elk were moved to Lamator Point within Point Reyes, and that's a free roaming herd. And another free roaming herd within Point Reyes was established at Drake's Beach. So you had 1 captive and 2 free roaming herds. And again, as I say, it's consistent with the mission of the national park. So here's the 3 herds of captive herd, which I think should be eliminated in 2021. There shouldn't be captive herds anymore. There should be free roaming herds, especially on public land. So that's a big battle that's going on at Point Reyes right now, the Pierce Point herd. Originally, it was 445 over the last few years. 152 died over the last year due to drought, and there was more elk than that historically. Some also died back in 2014, 2016. The captive herd didn't have enough water, and that's a battle that's going on right now. There's free roaming herd at Lamator is again still at 174, and the free roaming herd at Drake's Beach near the pastoral lands, and those are the lands that are where they're grazing cattle. And again, those ranchers on those pastoral lands were paid millions of dollars for their land several years ago, given leases to phase out their operations, which they haven't done. And they feel they still have a right to exist there. And that's, again, something that's going to be a big battle. So again, here's a beautiful bull again. And you can see that barbed wire fence off to the left side. And that holds these elk captive. Barbed wire fencing is horrible on public lands for our wildlife, for all species. I found many dead animals caught in barbed wire. And one of the ones I found in one of the areas that I was studying in the 80s was an elk that had jumped over a barbed wire fence. And as it jumped, it got its leg caught between the wires, it flipped over upside down, and it ended up upside down, rubbing its leg in the barbed wire. Mortality mode went off in its collar, but it didn't go off soon enough for me to get there in time. It took a couple of days to get out to that remote site. By the time I get there, the elk was dead. So it basically laid upside down, its leg stuck in the barbed wire, rubbed it till its leg was raw, and then died because of the heat extreme conditions. So barbed wire really is something that is a real challenge. And we really want to go to wildlife friendly fencing all over the state of California. So again, sources are reporting that captive herd elk, again, doesn't have water, although now we're hearing the last few days that the National Park Service is bringing in water. Whether the elk will drink out of those troughs, we'll have to see. And again, another 100 elk died in 2014, 2016. And again, 150 have died recently. We've had people out in the field out there that have been finding the dead elk. So, and the Park Service is saying this is a natural process, which is ridiculous for captive herds. So again, we'll see what happens on that one. So here are the next critical steps for our Tule elk, which is what is really cool is the public sentiment supports protecting and restoring our native and wild species. People love wildlife, especially on our public lands. The concept of preservation, protecting them in their native state, reintroduction, putting them back in their native habitat. And I'm not just talking about Tule elk, but in general, wildlife in general. Restoration and connectivity across the landscape is one of the themes that's becoming so important, for a large free roaming animal like a Tule elk becomes important for other wildlife species as well. So not just wild areas, but urban areas as well. Places like Coyote Valley, places like the Diablo Range, kind of on the edge of these urban areas. Native landscaping is critical. Reforestation is critical. Buffer zones around these areas where we find wild habitat, and urban guidelines for wildlife. And again, one of the key things is education. So we need to have education in our K through 12 schools. Tule elk curriculum needs to be a part of everybody's science curriculum. And higher education, the California Community College system, which accepts the top 100% of all students that apply. There's over 110 campuses, colleges, and so that needs to be where Tule elk are also taught as part of the regular curriculum, and obviously our universities and other colleges. So again, case study on the statewide California Department of Fish and Wildlife. There's somewhere around 5,000 elk, maybe 22 herds. Again, it's not really clear because some of the herds, as I mentioned, Carrizo, San Felipe, and others have disappeared. Reintroduction tool has been replaced by hunting as a primary management tool. And I've been battling with fish and game. Now they're Fish and Wildlife, but I still call them Fish and Game. Their staff, and I talked to the Tule elk coordinator several years ago, went up there, was lobbying. And I said, why do you allow hunting in some of these areas? Because we've got some real concerns about the genetics. And they said hunting Tule elk in California is a moneymaker. It's a moneymaker, a big moneymaker for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. I said, well, how can that be a moneymaker when less than 1% of California public hunts? And they said, well, Julie, the bottom line is they come from out of state. So we get a lot of people coming in, paying thousands of dollars to hunt Tule elk. And again, when people hunt them, the problem is they don't hunt the weak and sick. They look for the biggest bulls, and that raises some real concerns. So the key concerns is for Tule elk is that there's almost no connectivity between these 20-some populations. There's no viable meta populations or movement between those different herds, and that creates a problem. And remember that Tule elk went through what's called a population bottleneck. They went from over 500,000 individuals down to less than 20. So went through what we call a population bottleneck in the late 1870s. And that means that we lost, the genetic health becomes a key concern, and the loss of gene alleles. So the real question is, what is the genetic health? And we also have hunting, which has been ongoing, where they're taking the biggest, most robust bulls, which, the genetic health becomes another concern. So is hunting causing, and these practices causing, an evolution of the weak and sick? And that's one of the new phrases that's coming out in the field of ecology. We're seeing through hunting and these other activities, the evolution of the weak and sick. That's causing what's called a reverse in evolution. And so will the Tule elk populations be able to adapt to changes in the environment as relates to climate change and other concerns is a real issue. As we see climate change occurring already, and we're seeing changes in the native landscape, what will happen with our native oaks, what will happen with our native grasses, with our perennial bunch grasses and annuals, as well as our other shrubs and so on, native shrubs. It's just really a concern what will happen in the long run. So here's some suggested next steps. Tule elk should be a flagship species or an indicator species for our native grasslands, for our oak woodlands and oak savannas in our landscape, and also a focal species for connectivity in California. So if we provide connectivity across the landscape for Tule elk in the areas where it's possible, that will mean connectivity for all the other wildlife, which co-evolved as well. Elk provide coverage for the grasslands, the woodland associations, and these concepts of connected ecosystems. And again, is critical for large-scale habitat connectivity, as I continue to mention. And so I think we should create a Tule elk reserve, an open reserve, reestablish connectivity between the Diablo Range to the Central Valley and to the Sierra foothills, which would be incredible. And there's some spots I think would be really cool. Coyote Valley, maintaining connectivity between Santa Cruz Mountains and the Diablo Range. That's a study that we started many, many years ago when I was at De Anza College. And that really is an important area to protect because there's Tule elk in the Diablo Range in that area. And I also think we should establish a state designation for the Tule elk. So I went to the state of California and I met with legislators and others, said, I think they should become our state mammal. And I got this immediate pushback, Julie, the cow bear, people are going to be mad. And I said, well, I understand that, but the grizzly bear is extinct. It's embarrassing to have a state mammal that's extinct. And they said, well, I'm sorry, but it's just not going to be popular. So I said, well, how about if it becomes our state vertebrate or our state ungulate or whatever? And so there needs to be some special designation for the Tule elk because what they provide for the habitat is absolutely incredible and has great potential. So again, here's some other concepts of community-based conservation where the public becomes a key stakeholder. And this is just the fields of conservation biology, landscape ecology, ecosystem management. All these fields are now being taught in our colleges and universities. And the value of wildlife is understood. The public sentiment has shifted towards protection and preservation. And we need a land stewardship, a team approach. And many of the organizations like yours and others have been instrumental in kind of developing this concept of community-based conservation, which includes the public and students are key stakeholders. So we want to involve others as key stakeholders and resource agencies develop a team approach as well. So ecosystem management and community-based conservation is really about people who care so much about their quality of life today and in the future that they have chosen to work with others to improve the places where we live, work, play while restoring the native landscape. And so ecosystem management and community-based conservation is about that interface of science, people, and their governments as we all struggle to understand our collective impacts on our ecosystems and change our approaches using stewardship, sound science, sustainability as the guiding principles. And again, this will be absolutely instrumental with the challenge that we face to protect our native wildlife and native landscape in the face of things like climate change. And so I have created free Tule elk curriculum. If you know teachers that would be interested in others, they can download that free curriculum. I put the class in place at De Anza College. We taught a whole class on Tule elk, took hundreds and hundreds of students out in the field to see the native Tule elk. And the response by students was absolutely amazing. So you can go to my website at naturebasedteaching.com and you can download that or you can contact me and I can get that to you if you know others that would be interested. And again, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife is the state agency that has the legal jurisdiction over Tule elk in California. They're under the California Department of Natural Resources, and many of you already know. Wade Crowfoot is the California Secretary for Natural Resources. I've approached him personally, asking him, let's really have an effort to educate and protect, educate people about the Tule elk, protect the Tule elk, give them some special status. And I've also approached Gavin Newsom's office. I haven't had much success at it, but this is some places that groups and others can go to because again, if we protect the Tule elk and help restore the native landscape in areas where it's possible, it will have a huge impact on California. And so thank you all for your efforts on behalf of the environment and our native wildlife. And I'm so honored to be here with you today.
Awesome. Thank you, Julie. That was amazing. Great. That was a great talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
There's a few questions in the chat. Before I go to those, does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask Julie? If you do, raise your hand or go ahead and unmute yourself and ask away. This is before I get to any questions in the chat.
Well, I'm glad I twisted Julie's arm so tightly to do this talk.
How's it going, Robert?
Thank you, Robert.
All right. Yeah, I mean, I was one of her students many years ago, and her passion for wildlife corridors and connectivity, she beat that into me, which I really appreciate that. And also Tule elk stuff. I didn't take the Tule elk class, but I absorbed as much information I could over the years with her Tule elk information. So I'm so glad you're able to give this talk.
Thank you, Robert. I appreciate your leadership in terms of protecting the wildlife. It's amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Robert. Anyone else have any questions they'd want to ask Julie?
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick. I'm just curious about conversations with the ranchers that had a negative viewpoint towards Tule elk and whether you found any good strategies or had any successes in converting anybody to the side of the Tule elk in your time working with those ranching communities?
Well, I mean, I was on the ranches. It was nice that they would allow me to come onto the ranches. So I first had to, as the Tule elk would disperse off of the areas they were relocated into. So I'd have to kind of work with the ranchers, introduce myself and say, I'm here. And they would express their concerns. Obviously, I'd say, I understand. But, after a while, there were some that just say, no, you can't go on our land. We don't want you there. And there were others that would actually start being friendly. And then when they saw that I was a woman in the field in the 80s, a lot of them felt sorry for me, especially when I had one rancher who said, oh yeah, Julie, I know where the elk are. They're over there. And they sent me out where the rodeo bulls were. So they sent me out in there. So I got chased by rodeo bulls. And so then other ranchers felt sorry for me. It was just kind of this whole dynamic. But again, I understood what the challenge was to try. So I tried to talk to people and communicate as much as I could. In some cases I was successful. But I tried to say to them, they're not going to destroy your ranch. They're not going to destroy, the elk will shift in response to your cattle. They're not going to drive your cattle off your lands. So I think that was kind of one of the misinformation that was out there. So I would just try to work with them. And again, I think the fact that we have over 20 herds is really hopeful, but there should be more elk in some of those areas. And there should, on public lands, there definitely should be Tule elk over non-native domestic livestock. There's public policy still on the public lands that promotes cattle and other livestock on public lands when Tule elk could actually done the job better. So one of those is Point Reyes, where you go into those pastoral lands. They are so degraded. If they had allowed Tule elk to restore those native lands over time, it would have been amazing how it's restored, like a Pacheco Pass State Park that I mentioned. So it's been a challenge. It's been very difficult. But again, my hope was, I knew it was in this when I got involved. And my hope was that I could try to convince people over time, but it's been a challenge. Does that answer your question, or?
Yeah, I think so. Follow-up question with, the alternative idea of utilizing Tule elk as opposed to cattle for, conservation grazing purposes. One thing I've heard is that Tule elk require much larger and more robust fencing if you were going to have a managed herd, which I know earlier you mentioned you're sort of advocating against, right? Like fenced in contained herds isn't necessarily a great solution or a good viable option for sustainable Tule elk herds in the first place. But if you were planning on managing a habitat with Tule elk, is that true that you do need much more robust fencing? And can you really move them around the landscape in the way that you can move cattle around the landscape?
And I think that's a decision that has to be made. Is that how we want to manage elk? Do we want to be managers of elk? And again, I think there's people have proposed bringing elk into fenced areas and letting them, and I mean, there's some places where there are captive herds already. So I think our goal should be free roaming elk where possible. And if there has to be fencing, like there is, then they'll have to have wildlife friendly fencing. Or I think I absolutely agree. It has to be, Tule elk can jump a 6-foot fence. So obviously cattle can't. And so there has to be more robust fencing in areas. But my hope is that we can have those places where the Tule elk connectivity becomes a part of the management plan. So they move over various areas, and that's where the elk should remain or be reintroduced. But there's just those challenges, But a Point Reyes is a great example where the pastoral lands, the Tule go in there, they're going to restore that landscape, because that's what we teach in restoration ecology. The native wildlife does that job.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Great questions.
Julie, when did the Carrizo Valley population crash? Because I was interacting with them pretty often in 2010 and 2011. I was on the initial California Valley Solar Ranch project before construction, and I would be out there doing pre-dawn service or burrowing owls, and a herd of 40 would come roaring past me. And
That's
luckily
really
not.
So would you see them in the national monument lands? You're actually in the national monument
No,
lands?
I saw them across the cross 58 on the private 5,000-acre ranch, and they would be roaming around and behind or around and near the horse herd that was on the ranch.
Wow.
So they were behind barbed wire, but they could just, fly over those regular fences. But I rarely saw them on the monument, but they were more close to the pasture land along 58 on both sides, but mainly on the shifting my south side or north side of 58.
And I think that was one of the challenges is originally when the work was done in the 80s, when I was at Carrizo Plains for a few years there, the vision was that it would be in the national monument. And then eventually the decision was made to bring more cattle into the national monument and not remove some, so the elk got shifted out of that and went into other areas, surrounding lands. I mean, the last time I went to Carrizo in 2000, probably about 2010, didn't you think the land was in the national monument was extremely degraded?
I'm a little shocked that they would have Tule elk on that land because it was horrible. And all the surface water was basically contaminated with high mineral count. So, the salt ponds out there, where the pasture land was far richer, even though it's, invasive grasses, but it is a viable pasture land for the Tule elk. And they were just all over there. And also the pronghorn were over there too.
Yeah, the pronghorn, yeah. But again, Carrizo Plains, the last time I went, we just said, why don't they in a national monument make elk a priority over friggin' cattle? Those are public lands, and that was the vision of the state. But again, these are federal lands, so it's been a battle in Carrizo, and the landowners surrounding areas hate the elk, so they constantly lobby. It's just this, it's a very difficult. But the Tule elk could have restored that for all the native birds, the other native wildlife.
Yeah.
I mean, we didn't go back there. We were so shocked the last time we went. And then you got Chimeneas ecological area where they're allowed to shoot the elk. So the elk will shift into there, and then they have the hunting season. So the elk will shift out when they're being shot. So it's just this dynamic that where, if not on public lands, then where are these Tule elk? And again, national monuments are some of the least restrictive federal lands, but that was the vision. And again, you would hear some of the rangers out there, I guess they're called rangers, they hated the elk. I mean, I don't know if you ever.
Yeah, I've run into it. I worked at Rio Vista farms out there, right across Grizzly Island or Montezuma Slough from a Grizzly Island population. And I was out there when the elk were first crossing the river. The smart bulls, they would open up hunting on a lottery program in August of every year, and they would pick out bulls to be hunted. They weren't out. They were basically driving up that bull you shoot, and they'd hit it with a 30-06 from a scope. But the smart bulls were crossing the river into Rio Vista, into the Birds Landing area by the wind farm, and they were taking their cows with them. One year it was 5, the next year he brought over 15. And now the last time I was out there, I saw a bull out there with 45 cows.
Wow.
And a separate herd in the hills of Montezuma. And no longer, the Fish and Wildlife are no longer pushing them back across the river to the island. But it's great to see them on the island because that is Tule elk in Tules on that island. It's incredible to see them walking through.
Thank you for sharing that, Robert. That is such good news. I'll have to check that out. That's pretty incredible. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I give me a call. Let's just go up there on a weekend.
Yeah, that is amazing. That's so hopeful.
Julie,
But
I'm Dr.
Tanya
Hansen.
and my field partner found.
Hey, go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, okay. I'm Dr. Hansen, and I was involved in the earliest reintroduction of Tule elk into Fort Hunter Liggett and at Sinton Ranch, which moved into the Carrizo Plains, and also into that is around Diablo Mountain. And one of my grad students did a study of Tule elk on Fort Hunter Liggett this before it was closed off. And so I was involved in the very early reintroductions of the Tule elk. Benke Curtis, who used to work for the California Fishing Department, was the one that tapped me to do these studies. And I've one of the things that I've done is been able to follow Tule elk, and I've seen them as Robert said, north of Highway 58. They're in the Carrizo Plains.
That's so cool. And wasn't Benke Curtis amazing? He was fun to work with.
Oh yeah, he's a great
Wasn't he
person.
great? Yeah, he was just such an advocate for the elk, and that's so great. I probably met some of your grad students. I think they're probably out there when I was. Seems
Could have
familiar.
been Jim Willison was the grad student at Fort
Yeah.
Hunter Liggett.
Wow, that's amazing. That's so great. What's your feeling about the elk? How do you think it happens? Which is kind of your reaction?
Well, I'm glad to see that they have moved them around to various places. When we first started there, and they put them in Fort Hunter Liggett, you had what was called the Tule Elk Preservation League or something like that. They were instrumental in getting some of the laws passed.
Yeah.
And they came out and, we took them on a tour to look for the Tule elk around the Fort Hunter Liggett. They were kind of a little bit dismayed because you have the Hearst Ranch where you had Rocky Mountain elk.
Mhm.
And one of the persons felt that they should go and shoot out all the Rocky Mountain elk so that they could have it preserved just for Tule elk.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Yeah, that committee for the preservation of Tule elk, weren't they amazing? Like Beulah Edmondson and some of them. I mean, they were instrumental in saving the Tule elk, wasn't it? Weren't they amazing?
Yeah, they were.
Oh my
They,
gosh.
they were kind of a funny group. One of the person's name was Loosely, and I think his personality fit his name.
That's fun. That's so great. Well, you have quite a bit of history with the elk. That's amazing with your grad students. That's so important.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I'm going to get a few questions in the chat before I forget. That Tule elk guide you showed us in the beginning, that's a really great resource. Is there a way to provide a link to that in the chat, or maybe send it to the Wildlife Society and we can provide it to?
Sure. Yeah. I can send it to you, Sean, and you're welcome to send it out to whoever like, because if you go to my site, you have to pay for it. I mean, I'm happy to share it with people. So what I'll do is I'll just, I'll send it to you and you're welcome to share the PDF with anybody from the Wildlife Society that would like a copy.
Sure, that sounds good. If anyone here is interested, I'll put my email in the chat. And they can reach out to me. Let's see. I have a question for genetic diversity. Is there any, since you had that bottleneck you talked about earlier, is there any thoughts of bringing elk from different herds across the state and like moving them around to increase genetic diversity in the individual herds if the herds themselves are so have a lack of genetic diversity? I don't know if that makes sense or not. But.
Yeah. And I think the key thing to do first is where can we provide landscape connectivity between existing herds? And that should be the first thing that's kind of done at a state level. Let's look at those herds. And the new field of this growing is landscape ecology, landscape connectivity. And so Tule elk should be the model for the state of California. So let's take the existing herds. Let's look at where connectivity is possible. And let's look into purchasing lands so that can happen. There's a lot of herds that could be connected. So when you try to move herds, it's so friggin' traumatic for the Tule elk. So they'll often chase them with helicopters. They chase them into netting or into an area. They corral them. They fit, and they cover them up. They put them into trailers. I mean, a lot of them some end up dying as a result of it. They get so traumatized. It's been hard watching some of those. So to me, if we can do it in a more scientifically sound way, looking at the ones where we still could have some connectivity, like the one I mentioned, could we connect the herds in the Diablo range across this part of the Central Valley? There's still lands that are open, and actually have it into the foothills of the Sierra. There seems like there could be some spots where that's possible. So, I mean, that's the biggest one. But the other part is the hunting of the herds. When you're hunting them, they're taking the biggest bulls. So how do we look at that process? Could there be some other way to think about hunting? I mean, obviously, could they shoot? I mean, I don't know. I think it's a challenge, but it seems like in this day and age, with this being taught in all colleges and universities, this is a perfect example of a team approach where students could be part of that process to look at the role of Tule, which would benefit coyotes, bobcats, birds, insects. I mean, it could have, obviously plants, the landscape itself, it could have a positive impact because Tule elk is an indicator and flagship species for the health of the native environment.
Yeah, I agree. Awesome.
I'm sorry. I want to address a little bit on the genetic diversity. And when we started, there was only about 3 herds. One was at Tupman, Tule Elk Reserve, and then of course there's over in the Owens Valley, and then I can't remember where the other one was. But what has happened is that in the Tupman Reserve, we had shortening of the jaws, in which of course with the elk, the teeth need to come up and hit the upper plate in order to clip the vegetation. And with shortening of the jaw, they weren't able to do that. So what they did is they captured some elk from out of the Owens Valley and brought them over to the Tupman Tule Elk Reserve and released them there. And then the elk that were having the shortening of the jaw, they went in there and sterilized them. And of course, one of the things out of the Owens Valley, they had a permanent corral that was built that was used to herd the elk into when they picked them up. And we didn't have any problems in losing any of the elk when we moved them over to the Hunter Liggett. And like Julie showed, they had a corral there where they were kept for quite a while. And they put them in these trailers, and basically they just drove all night to get them from the Owens Valley to the Fort Hunter Liggett.
Yeah, great points. So we could still use some of that technology and ideas today, you know, if we wanted to move out.
Yeah, for sure. Another question from the chat. Elk from Steve Schubert. Elk were reintroduced at Camp Roberts near Hunter Liggett, and volunteers like myself assisted with monitoring and feeding while in the holding pen until released. What happened to that population? So maybe the Camp Roberts population.
Yeah, I really don't know. Michael, do you know? I really don't know what's happening.
I don't know what's happened with the Camp Roberts herd. I have seen the elk on Fort Hunter Liggett, and a lot of times when I'm driving through there, but as far as I know, they're doing okay on Fort Hunter Liggett.
Mhm. Yeah, sometimes it's really difficult to get information, to get access to some of these lands, some of these places.
I used to have a kit fox study on Camp Roberts, and I don't ever remember seeing the Tule elk on Camp Roberts after they had been released there.
Okay. Okay, thank you. That's all the questions I had in the chat. If anyone else has any more questions, so speak up.
I'm based in Santa Clara County, and our office, our San Jose office, I was asked to write up a protocol for collecting scat on different open space lands that we might be doing other studies on. And that way the DNA from the scat can be, and also check out the health of the herds, because you don't want to walk up and draw blood on them. So I don't think we've had to use the protocol yet, but at least we're looking at some point, you know, having the opportunity to get them in the Mount Diablo range. But Tanya Diamond and my field partner Katrina found Tule elk scat on the other side, on the Santa Cruz side of Coyote Valley.
Wow.
So they crossed back over, and we know where, at Burnell, at that overpass, but they ventured over to Santa Cruz side. And I argued with you in the past about it, but now I accept the fact that they would do quite well in the oak woodlands of Santa Cruz Mountains. Yeah, I think at some point, if we get that wildlife bridge, they'll definitely be crossing into that area, because we now have that open space. Open space bought that one section that was going to be a warehouse that you and I have looked at in the past. And I actually had a high school senior do the senior project from my daughter's high school, which is a college prep school. And he approached me wanting to do an HCP. Here's an 18-year-old saying, hey, I want to write an HCP for an area. And I go, okay, that's encompassing. Why don't I taught him about corridors, and he wrote a project of making a wildlife bridge over 101 into Coyote Valley, making Monterey Road go, or Santa Teresa go up on an overpass, and animals could cross through. And that's actually where part of the open space bought up. So kids are looking at it.
Well, and you can go to my website, naturebasedteaching.com, and you know, Robert, because you were out there. So we published safe passages, you know, landscape connectivity for Coyote Valley many years ago. We started the original, and that just got so much potential there. So it's really cool what Tanya and the team is doing, and others like yourself. It's very hopeful, but it's a really good model for other places as well to take that connectivity work that we did And again, students were instrumental in collecting all the data. So they were in class, but they also had to be scientists in class, and these were often non-majors as well. So it was pretty cool. So that's
It's
pretty neat.
city kids out there.
Yeah. Get kids, I mean,
Have you
nature-based
joined-
teaching is important, being out in nature.
Have you talked to the Rangeland Coalition in Alameda County? Because they're out in all out in the Diablo range. And that's a way that because at my projects, I'm the one that gets sent in to talk to ranchers because I have a way to talk to them. But the coalition is really, they're helping promote, wise grazing practices, moving your cattle, moving your water. And the fact that elk do not overgraze and would improve the landscape for ranchers, because we got to have some ranch land because 90% of our endangered species are on rangeland, and just got to deal with a way to handle it. But the Rangeland Coalition of Alameda County is a very interesting group, very open for new ideas.
That's really cool because it's just, as you know, Tule elk has been a hated. I mean,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, but now we know, I think we're seeing a change, we're seeing a shift. And I think we're seeing a shift in people's thinking, that we can now think about the landscape in a new way and that we can co-evolve, but it's been a challenge, that's for sure. So great suggestion, thank you.
Yeah, that's nice to hear about Alameda County. I mean, I'm from Livermore. Whenever I drive from Monterey to Livermore, whenever I hit 84 off of 680 going east, I'm always looking for, there's one bull elk that's really well known out there, and I haven't seen it yet. And I always see photos, not always, but sometimes see photos online, on like Facebook groups I follow, and I always keep my eye out for him. But I haven't seen him yet off of 84. But hearing that Alameda County is, or the coalition of Alameda County is open to new things that could be good, that's encouraging. So
Great points. And that's so cool.
yeah. Yeah, we have a couple more minutes. Does anyone else have any questions for Julie? And I will say, Jackie said that the Tule elk are fine on Hunter Liggett. Jackie is our TWS Central Coast president, and she works on Hunter Liggett, so she has a good in on their status. Sounds like
That's great news. That's great. Thank you. It's so important.
yeah. So if anyone else has any other questions, we have 2 more minutes. We can round out the hour.
If people are interested in reading it, the CDFW has a report out. I think they put it out in 2017. It's the Elk Conservation and Management Plan, and it covers all the different subspecies that are in California and where they are as of 2017. It's an interesting read. You read the one side because the CDFW, but it also shows which herds are being hunted, which ones are not, public lands and parks and so forth, and some populations are on private property. But the elk report, management report, is an interesting read if you do work in California in wildlife work.
Great suggestion. I also keep bugging California Department of Fish and Wildlife because I also think they should promote not just the hunting of the elk, but looking at them for landscape connectivity and everything. And it's just, there's always this constant dynamic that they really need to not just think about as being hunted, which obviously that's not going to stop. But when less than 1% of California public hunts, as I mentioned, everybody coming in to shoot them is from out of state. And again, Fish and Game sees it as a moneymaker, and I understand that, but I actually think they could generate more revenue by having people go out and actually see the elk and promoting those programs as well. Because people just love, Point Reyes, people are going to Point Reyes just to see the Tule elk and other species.
Yeah.
And again, I think that's a big one, is let's change some of the concepts within California Department of Fish and Wildlife. They need to really emerge into the 21st century when this is being taught now, landscape ecology, restoration ecology. These things are all being taught in the classroom. And so I appreciate their work, but I also think, we should look at the long-term vision of Tule elk being a flagship species for the state of California.
I agree. Well, thank you, Julie. This was a great talk and really nice Q&A. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Couple quick shout outs. Keep an eye out for our High Mountain event in October 30th, and also our annual symposium coming up in middle of November on the 19th. So thank you everyone for joining. And again, thank you, Julie, for presenting. This was awesome. And everyone have a great rest of your Tuesday evening. So thanks again. All
Thank
right.
Bye, everyone. Thank you for your leadership.